So I've now reviewed all the games in the Jak and Daxter trilogy. However, there is one more game in the main series I've yet to look at. Naughty Dog left the series after making 3 games and a racing game, just like with Crash Bandicoot, and moved on to the Uncharted games. However, this was during the time when Sony was trying to get as many PSP spin-offs to their main franchises as possible, so we got Daxter and the game I'll be reviewing today, Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier. The strangest thing about The Lost Frontier is that it was released in November 2009, 5 years after Jak 3. I said it was part of the main series, and while that's technically true, it has to be noted that this game was originally meant to be a PSP exclusive, but it was then ported onto the PS2. It also wasn't made by Naughty Dog, but by High Impact Games, who handled the PSP Ratchet & Clank games. So, is The Lost Frontier a welcome return for Jak and Daxter, or should it be ignored in the same way as The Wrath of Cortex? Let's have a look. The story takes place after the events of Jak 3, although you don't need to know the details of Jak 3 to understand what's going on. The world is suffering from an eco shortage, so Jak, Daxter and Kira are trying to find a new eco source. Along the way they frequently encounter a sky pirate called Phoenix and a duke called Skyheed. The story as a whole is pretty good. It hits the same notes as the other Jak games, a range of characters, Daxter making his jokes throughout, and a large scale story. All those elements aren't as strong here as they were before, but this does feel like a Jak and Daxter story. The actual look of the cutscenes though could have been better. They no longer use the in-game graphics, which I understand as The Lost Frontier was meant to be just a PSP game, but they don't look as good. They also decided to redesign all the characters, which is supposed to make them look older, but it feels completely unnecessary. The look of the characters isn't improved by the new design, so it just makes the game feel a bit disconnected from the originals. Despite this, while the story doesn't compare to Jak 2 and 3, it is solid. The gameplay is once again split into many different styles, so let's start with the platforming. The normal levels of the games have you making jumps as well as shooting at enemies. The first thing you will notice is the change of controls. As this was meant to be a PSP exclusive, the game itself was designed around only using one imprecise analog stick. It results in stricter movement than you would expect in a 3D platformer. When you go left to right, Jak will slightly strafe and the camera won't always stay behind you. I was playing the PS2 version where you can control the camera with the right analog stick, but doing this just leads to the camera going through walls. Despite the controls not being as fluid, it isn't a major problem. Once you play the game for half an hour or so, you get used to how it handles, and I had very little trouble overall. The levels are designed around these controls, so as long as you let the game pick the camera angles and try not to change them too much, you should be fine. Saying this, there were times when I was trying to complete a platforming section and the controls and camera made it more difficult than it needed to be. I can't completely excuse the way Jak handles, but it by no means breaks the game. Light and Dark Jak are now gone and have been replaced by new eco powers. There is the Eco Amplifier that releases exploding energy balls, the Eco Teleport that allows Jak to walk with certain statues, Eco Reflexes that slows down time, Eco Shield that creates a shield around Jak, Eco Boost that allows you to hover across gaps as well as rocket propel yourself on eco streams, and finally Eco Construct that lets you create crystal platforms. They did a really great job with the eco powers in this game. Using them adds to the platforming sections and helps breaks up gunfights. Despite having so many eco powers, they are easy to use and introduced to you at the right pace. Using them is fun, especially when you're trying to solve the puzzles that you're presented with. They aren't anything too hard, but you will have to stop and think a bit about them, as well as having to combine the different eco powers. The coolest thing about them though is that they all have dual uses. The Eco Amplifier is needed to break down rock walls, but it can also be used to blow up enemies. It means they both add to the platforming, but also give you a more diverse range of offensive and defensive abilities against enemies you fight. It feels like this is how the eco power should have been handled in the Precursor Legacy, which doesn't take anything away from that game, but does help this one stand out. The impression I got with The Lost Frontier is that it would feel more like the first game due to it being called Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier. This is definitely not the case for two reasons. The first is that the guns return from Jak 2 and 3. The gunfights are not good. There is still no proper lock-on and all the fun gun mods from Jak 3 have been removed. The camera and controls also let the gunfights down, as while the camera will automatically lock onto enemies, it's not perfect. I have to say that I enjoyed the gunfights here more than in Jak 2. The first reason is that the health system is the same as Jak 3 rather than Jak 2's, so enemies' attacks will vary in damage that they do to you. The second is that the enemy and enemies' attacks are more simple, so having the gunfights feel messy isn't as frustrating. I know that might sound like an odd point, but when there isn't as much going on, such as you don't have to escort anyone, you don't get sucked into the gunfights as much, so they're not as stressful when you fail. The final reason I prefer the combat here is the new upgrade system. You collect ores from enemies you kill that can be spent on melee and health upgrades. It's nice to have the option of getting upgrades for the part of the combats that you actually use, and it makes everything feel less limited. Overall, when it comes to the combat, the variety with the upgrades and eco powers makes it decent, but I wouldn't say it's engaging. The second thing that separates this game from the Precursor's Legacy is its structure. There is a focus on skyships, so the world is split into different regions that you can fly to on your main ship. Once in a region, you can fly to the different levels in a smaller ship and complete any side missions. Flying is a large part of the Lost Frontier, where certain story missions will have you take down other fighters and blowing stuff up. When I first started using the ships, the controls felt either too sensitive or not sensitive enough. However, after a short time I completely got used to how they handled. Unlike when you play as Jak on the ground, the controls and camera do actually work well. If you want a comparison, think the space battles in Star Wars Battlefront 2. The flying sections are pretty fun, but nothing special. They were fun at first, but as you progress through the game, the missions start to get longer, so flying missions can become a bit tedious. They never become bad, but be prepared to have to shoot at certain targets over and over and over again. You can also customize your ship and buy different upgrades and weapons. It's not as deep as an RPG system, but there is a charm to playing with the different weapons and customizing your ship loadouts. While the missions can drag later on in the game, the flying is a good addition as it really helps to give this game its own distinct feel, and it creates a cool open world. The last addition I'm going to discuss has to be the weirdest. At certain points in the game, Daxter will be transformed by Dark Ito into Dark Dax, who is essentially the Tasmanian Devil. You then control Dark Dax through levels which use a fixed overhead camera where you smash enemies and solve simple puzzles. These levels are decent enough and do add a variety to the game, but it does feel like the only reason they're here is so they could create levels more tailored for the PSP. They're a bit out of place as Dark Dax has no impact on the story, but they're a nice distraction. The game itself took me around 6 hours to beat, but that's with me ignoring the majority of the side missions. The side missions aren't anything interesting though, so I'll leave it up to you to whether 6 hours is long enough. Jak and Daxter and the Lost Frontier is a successful spin-off. It has all the right elements from the original games while keeping things fresh with its own unique ideas. However, as I stated at the beginning of the review, this is a main series game, which means that there are two ways you can judge it. It's either a great PSP spin-off or a limited PS2 main series title. This isn't a major problem as the game itself is fun despite a few flaws, but it really does make you wonder how good this game would have been if it wasn't held back by the PSP. My score is 7.0 out of 10. The Lost Frontier is filled with plenty of good ideas for a great platformer, but the technology stops it from reaching the same heights as Jak 3.